the most bizarre notion of all, and it goes directly back to the Turners, is the idea of doing PT in an extended rectangular formation. I mean, it's just, I don't even know how to describe it. It makes no sense at all. And it's self-defeating. It's not going to get us to where we go because it automatically gets dumbed down to the lowest common denominator.
Welcome back to another week with Drew and Alex here at the Mops and Mo's podcast. Today, I think we have set a record for the longest episode.
First off, he says he thinks we've set a record. I'm pretty sure we've doubled any previous episode.
We've probably
here.
doubled. It's a long one, so buckle up, but it's good.
And it is with a special guest. It's been overdue. I've been meaning to do this one for a little while. We have Dr. Whitfield East. He goes by Chip. He got his bachelor's degree in geography and physical education, as well as his master's degree in kinesiology and exercise science, both from UNC Chapel Hill.
Woo!
Then he got his PhD in biomechanics from Indiana. And since the PhD wasn't enough, he also got his EDD in kinesiology and applied statistics from the University of Georgia. He has taught at 3 universities: the University of Northern Iowa, East Tennessee State University, where he was the chair for the Department of Physical Education, Exercise, and Sports Sciences from 1986 to 2000. And finally at West Point, which is where I first met him, although he may or may not remember that. I think he substitute taught one of the courses I was in when I was a cadet there. And then our paths crossed again when he was in his final position that he retired out of, which is the research physiologist at CIMT. We started chatting a little bit because I was at the physical fitness school while he was there. And we've kind of riffed for a while, having some long conversations about this kind of stuff. But most notably in that role, he spearheaded the creation of the Army Combat Fitness Test. And he's also the author of the book we're going to talk about for basically this entire episode, which is his history of Army physical readiness training. The second edition of which should be coming out pretty soon here. So we're excited for that, but we're going to be talking about the first edition in this conversation.
Yeah, so the full title of the book is A Historical Review and Analysis of Army Physical Readiness Training and Assessment. It sounds like your typical kind of dry Army publication, but I assure you this is 250 plus pages of fascinating military physical culture, especially if you're into that sort of thing like I am. You can actually read this thing for free, and we'll include the PDF link in the show notes. Or you can get the hard copy on Amazon. Alex mentioned that there's a second edition coming out hopefully soon, depending on how fast, that type of thing goes. But we mentioned this later on in the episode. For folks that want to know a little bit how the sausage is made, typically we have notes that we put down before an episode, and usually it's about 1 to 2 pages of things that we want to talk about, and we kind of riff on that as we work through with our guests. For Dr. East, I think you said that you had 12 pages of notes.
Yeah, it was 12. It ended up at 13 as we kind of added stuff while we were talking to him.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, just sort of goes to show you that the idea of having a succinct conversation on the history of physical culture in the military is asinine. This was never not going to be a long episode, but I think it's definitely it punches above its weight in terms of interesting tangents you could go down and interesting conversations that we have with Dr. East. And that's not even to touch on, again, the book and the references that the book has. You could go down a million different rabbit holes in terms of sort of the nature of, physical testing in the Army.
And I admit it towards the end of the episode, but I'm going to just say it up front here. I have pointed countless people towards this book before. I've cited this book before.
We've talked about it a couple of times on the podcast.
Yeah, we have referenced it, but it was not until I was under the gun, knew we had to bring Dr. East on the podcast and talk to him, that I really got around to reading the entire book cover to cover. And the amount of new things I learned, the amount of things I thought we were doing for the first time that have actually been around for like hundreds of years, there's tons of insight in this for anybody who cares about Army fitness and where it's been and where it's going. It's a gold mine of insight.
Enjoy. I want to know. So I've been to a lot of my exposure to like and I'm going to mispronounce this, but is it Turnverein? Turnverein. So yeah, the Turner movement. I don't know if you've been to the Museum of Physical Culture down at University of Texas in Austin, but they have a ton of, old kettlebells, old barbells, just like stuff from that age. And I was not aware that was as big of a factor in some of these early iterations of, I wouldn't say physical tests, although you might correct me, but just the landscape with which the US military was looking at physical culture. And I'd be curious to sort of kick things off with kind of that and then start moving forward from there.
So one of my patent opening statements is the physical training program for the United States Army was developed in 1806 in Jena, Prussia, which is relatively true. There was a period of time between, let's just say, roughly 1750 to the early turn of the century into the 1800s, where there was a very aggressive gymnastics movement across Europe. And there were a couple of key players involved in that. And ultimately, it culminated. Most of the individuals who were involved early with this movement were either ministers trained in the church and or educators, or both. So the person that we think about the most is Friedrich Jahn, who was in Jena and was hired as a teacher. And basically, he kind of came to the conclusion that you could only have kids sitting around for so many hours every day. So he took what he knew already about movement and gymnastics, and he turned that into a program that the students would do for various periods during the day. As fate would have it, he later got involved in the Second French-Prussian War, and he was in a unit that was primarily made up of his former students as well as his friends that he knew in the gymnastics world. And that's kind of, I think, a kind of a fascinating story, the Schweizerjäger, the Black Hunters. So they did incredibly well, and they attributed their prowess to their physical abilities that they developed through doing these gymnastics. And gymnastics was a term that's taken on a certain connotation now. That's not what it was in 1806. It was, climbing ladders and climbing ropes and doing balancing things and a lot of body weight stuff, but they also did some strength conditioning. So that was the start of it. And there was a huge migration of turners. It was so well received in the French-Prussian War. It was so well received that it got built into the educational system in Prussia. And some political things went on, and later on, about 20 years later, 1820 to 1840, there was a mass migration of turners to the United States, and they brought all this with them to the United States. And you see this a lot in the development of what were called normal schools. And almost every university at that time that was focused primarily on teacher education had what was called a normal school. And it was it brought about a lot of this Turner philosophy. Long story short, we get up to Herman Keeler, who eventually gets hired to go to West Point. And what a lot of people don't know about Keeler was he was hired as a civilian, was later commissioned, and basically that was where all of this manifest and took hold. And literally he spread it all around the Army by virtue of the fact that he was training cadets at West Point. So that's kind of the quick connection between the gymnastics movement in Europe. There are a couple other interesting characters. Folkenkleis, who was the first headmaster in England, and who, by the way, was an American citizen, which is kind of interesting, and his story, I think, is very interesting. So
I remember reading that about, and I'm probably gonna say this wrong, but you mentioned he was an American citizen, and the fact that like the physical fitness of the British Army, which served as the template for later on down the road the American military, came from an American citizen who was overseas in the UK. Did I do that right?
Oh, as the story goes, when he became college age, his father was dissatisfied with university education in the United States and was taking Kleis to England to be educated properly. And somewhere along the way, or right after he got there, his father died. And he was like, they had a packet full of cash that they had taken with them to pay the bills. And he's like, well, I can go to college or I can go scamper about Europe. And he took off. And this is somewhat validated and somewhat anecdote. But along the way, he picked up a wife. He got to Switzerland, ostensibly out of cash. And what a lot of people do when they run out of cash, when they have a family to support, he joined the Army. And he was training soldiers one day, and they were out playing grab ass and doing all kinds of things that Joes want to do. And he said, cease work, get in a formation, we're going to do this and this and this, because he had studied gymnastics during his trek across Europe. And he was there one day when a bunch of liaison officers from the British Army were there, and they were like, what's he doing? This is really cool. So they went back and told the king, got to hire this dude and bring him, and they did. And so that's how it got started in England in the early 1820s, before Hammersley and all the rest of that bunch.
So I have a feeling we're going to focus most of this discussion on like U.S. military fitness history. Your book starts like pre-recorded history to a certain extent, but one thing I want to cover briefly before we leave the like European influences behind a little bit. One of your notes, the Denmark Institute of Military Gymnastics was founded in 1804, and they were training essentially NCO extended, like their era's version of master fitness trainers for their units. And they quickly came to the realization that this kind of has to be inserted earlier in people's upbringing. It has to be in public schools to really have that much impact. So by 1828, that was the law, requiring physical education in all their elementary schools. But that, like, only a few years later, mid 1800s, you've got debate going on about whether physical education belongs in public schools in the first place. It feels like very little has changed since the mid 1800s, because they're talking about the exact same approaches as we're talking about today. They're talking about the exact same problems as we're talking about today.
I mean, that's 200 years.
That it feels eerily similar to the exact same situation we're dealing with 200 years later.
So I'm not, clearly Denmark was a part of this whole process, but what you described is more or less exactly what happened in Prussia. And what happened when the French-Prussian War ended, folks at the top of the pyramid in the Army were so impressed with what Friedrich Jahn and his troops were able to do that they instituted it into the public school system. The problem that occurred in Prussia, which ultimately resulted in this outmigration, was they were fanatic nationalists, and they were, you know, it's us and no one else, and so it became a political problem, and the physical education program that was mandated became a casualty of that political, and that lasted for about 20 more years, and then it came back in later. I don't know the exact date, 1850, 1860. It came back again and stayed. And in the Prussian army, they had a centralized training program that they ran, and it was, you know, I think it was a 3 to 6 month program, and essentially it was exactly what we should be doing in the Master Fitness program, with the right resources and the right you know, requirements. So yeah, it's unfortunate how we circle back to the same problems, and this reemerges right at the beginning of World War I in 1816, 17, 18, and then again in a huge way in the aftermath of World War II, you know, having Kennedy and Eisenhower come on board, and President's Council, and the testing and those types of things. So it's, you know, you've got the photo on the wall behind you there. So yeah.
It's a theme in our conversations.
Well, I wanted to ask, because one of the quotes, and I'm gonna misuse this quote, but effectively it's this idea that physical fitness only really seems to enter the public forum when you know, crisis happens, war, what have you. And so my question, I guess, for you for this time period, this 1800 pre-World War I, maybe even into World War I, conversation around fitness specific to, I guess, the military, was there, I mean, when we think about fitness discussions for the military now, a lot of it has to do with what we see in the social sphere, like, you know, overweight, obesity, just a lack of activity in the general population. But when I think about like 19th century folks, you know, late 1800s, early 1900s, it's a much more active population in my mind. So what is driving the conversation for introducing a lot of this physical culture into the military around that time period?
So I have a tendency to benchmark things against quasi-technological changes in how we fight wars. And although, you know, bows and arrows and spears were deadly, not quite the same effect as a, you know, AK-47 or whatever, or a cruise missile or a bazooka, you know, whatever that is. And so beginning, and I it's just not something I've studied a lot, but we began in Europe to develop artillery, and it was towed artillery. So when you're fighting, things had to move very quickly, and it could be over quite a distance. The same thing happened in 1915, 16, 17 with the development of the tank. And so if I have a cannon that I'm towing it on a, you know, a caisson or whatever, however I'm towing it by horseback, and we have to move 5 miles and reset up and load and fire, I got to have soldiers there to do that. So mobility became a big issue, and those types of armaments, if you will, if that's the right word,
Mm-hmm.
required an increase in strength and power. It's even more evident at the end of World War I. You know, the first tank, I think, was moving 2 or 3 miles an hour, maybe 4. But that was a pretty good distance to cover, especially if someone was shooting at you, or if it was over a very rolling type of terrain. So I think, you know, technology has precipitated the changes in fitness level, which is really interesting, I think, because a lot of people like to peg it to combat load, and I didn't do a lot of research on this, but
Mm-hmm.
it's my understanding that Roman soldiers were carrying somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 60 pounds as far as their combat loads. So simply the physiological capacity to manage your combat load really wasn't it. It was speed and power and to a lesser degree strength. So I think and then on top of that, especially in the United States, we made a decision at the very outset that we were not going to have a large standing army. The army that we have today is probably larger than anyone ever really considered, especially if you add the Guard and Reserve to the mix. So what the decision was we would have a group of civilians who were part-time soldiers, if you will. I don't know what else term to use, and that when they needed to fight, they would plus up to full-time and fight. That was a little more manageable for the first 150 or 175 years, because the labor that individuals did was much more strenuous, a lot of movement, a lot of lifting, a lot of those types of things. And when we moved out of that in the 20s and 30s, you know, we saw, I mean, we didn't really have basic training per se until really World War II and after. We had some, you know, we had to learn drill and ceremony and learn how to shoot and learn how to march and take orders and do facing movements and all those types of things. But you really didn't do physical training very much. It really harkens back to the early 1820s, and they did it as punishment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they even called them fatiguing drills. They did it to tire people out. And then there was as we got into World War I and World War II, there was a big emphasis on sport. So there's a lot of sport during basic training and those types of things. So it's really unfortunate. I think in the book I use this term sinusoidal curve. We have this surge and purge syndrome where, you know, balloon goes up, everybody's freaking out, they've got to get fit, they've got to go fight. And we've seen, you know, you go back to Task Force Smith and the debacle that we had there, and it's a problem. And we as a society don't really value that in general. So I'll talk about sport because that's almost as big a problem. So,
well, one of the things that was interesting too around that time period, and something I didn't know until I read your book, was that it seems like this was when we also started to understand as a society the benefits that physical activity had for health and wellness. And you mentioned in a lot of these previous wars, obviously, you know, disease was probably the main killer of soldiers, to include, you know, battlefield statistics. And so, you know, switching from this punishment idea towards like, hey, we need to keep these folks healthy because we have shown that, you know, effectively keeps them from dying from illness. So that was an interesting thing there. Did that drive some of the introduction of the physical fitness tests that we started to see around this time period?
So just one quick comment, and then up until really 1930-ish, the preponderance of fatalities were injury and illness, and much more illness. I mean, we just go back to the Spanish flu in 1918, and I think the Army lost 40,000+ soldiers to Spanish flu. So when you look at all the early FM 21-20s, the training manuals, they talk about vigor and health a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the really interesting things is, I think it's way understated, is in the late 20s, early 30s, they cracked the code on penicillin and how to use sulfa drugs properly. And so all of a sudden, people who were dying of a variety of illnesses, not the least of which, combat casualties, they weren't dying anymore. They were surviving. They didn't die of pneumonia and tuberculosis, all those things. And so there was a kind of an immediate shift, and it literally was almost overnight from 75-25 illness injury KIA to 75-25 illness injury KIA. So it was very dramatic, and you'll start looking at the FM 21-20s in the 40s, and you'll see that health and vigor go away. You'll see it's no longer one of the primary tenets of why we train physically or why we test. And so as the testing requirements became more front and center, it was more your ability to execute your military task, your mission essential task list, whatever term you want to use. And I always go back to 1918, 1919, and Ray Croft and the manual that he wrote with the 5-item test that had a very generic little obstacle course that if you understand anything about combat in World War I and look at that obstacle course, you go, well, yeah, people had to jump up out of a defilade and race across a broken field and jump over barbed wire and yada, yada. And so it was almost all of that testing, even into World War II, was primarily task oriented. So, but with that said, it was virtually 100% related to informing the commander of two things. One, can Joe do his or her job? I guess no, her. Can Joe do his job? And if he can't, what do I need to do to get him up to speed? And so that was kind of the two prongs of why they did a lot of the testing at that time.
So I got to ask this question because as I was reading this and the introduction of these tests, this obstacle course, the individual efficiency test, do you know if there was any sort of bureaucratic red tape or backlash around? Because I'm thinking now of like the ACFT and how, Congress gets involved. There's all these gender standards and everybody has a say, and you end up just shredding the initial idea for this test. When they launched this in the early 1900s, was anyone like fighting it, or did everybody look at that and be like, yeah, that makes sense?
No, I mean, we didn't have a SecDef back then. We had a Secretary of War, and they had it was, whatever that saying is about, a 4-star general on the battlefield. Well, this was even more so in terms of kind of absolute control. So yeah, no, you got to remember, first of all, it was all men.
Mm-hmm.
We also have to remember that the size of the Army by comparison today was tiny. I'm trying to pull this out of the air, but I want to say the TO&E, the manning table for the Army in 1917-18 was like 128,000 or so. Now that may have been just before they started
127,500 officers and soldiers, April 6, 1917. Sorry, just Googled that one.
Yeah. So, right. And then, of course, we went to whatever it was, 5 million or something really quickly. But bottom line is the totality of what the Army did was kind of sacrosanct. You know, when you have the types of casualties that we had in the Civil War and World War I, World War II, people don't question things. When you have, you know, even during Vietnam, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 casualties a year. Maybe not quite that, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 a year. Which you break that down, that's 400 or 500 a month. When people are dying, they don't question those types of things.
Well, the other thing that I thought was interesting for the Rycroft situation with his individual efficiency test was that there were different grades. Like you had when you first got in, it was, you know, no equipment at all. And then it kind of ratchets up to where you're doing the thing with a full combat load. That was an interesting take. And I'd be curious how folks would do on the ACFT if they had their full combat load. I mean, that's an entirely different test.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things we played around with. So I'm a big fan of the indoor obstacle course test at West Point.
Oh, Alex loves it.
So one of the things we toyed around with for a long time was doing it under load. And so we would get, you know, IBA or get some type of body armor and try to do, and everything changed in the blink of an eye. It was, and that's one of the issues that we have going forward as an Army. Not so much because of combat loads, although those are a problem. I mean, go back to Grenada and read the stories about, you know, out of Grenada. The mobility factor just gets kind of really trashed, and the fatigue factor goes up significantly. And then, so to be as efficient as possible, I have to increase physiological capacity. That's my own, because absolute workload isn't going to change. I mean, my IBA and with front and back and plates and is going to be, you know, 20 whatever pounds, and skin out, I'm going to be at 60 to 80 pounds in my combat load. So it's really important that we focus on the physiological capacity required to fight that.
So one thing I was thinking through as far as like a structure to this conversation is kind of to like trace the evolution of testing. And Drew's already messed me up a little bit because
I'm all over the place because I love this stuff.
He skipped straight to 1920 Raycroft, and I want to go back. And I don't really have like a question here as much as like cleaning up a couple of things for the historical perspective's sake for the audience a little bit. One, Dr. East mentioned this indirectly, but I think it's helpful to realize that prior to World War I, basic training was not a separate thing. It was conducted by the units themselves. It wasn't particularly standardized. Although something I found really interesting from the book was the Commission on Training Camp Activities recommendations, and their recommendation that every training camp have an athletic director. We can go that direction, but the other one was similar time frame. Rewinding from the individual efficiency test was General Orders number 44, which mandated, well, I don't know if it quite mandated, and you can probably help me out here, Dr. East, but it recommended gymnastics, athletics, bayonet training, swimming, and weekly marches of 12 miles for the infantry, 18 miles for horse-mounted artillery and cavalry, a 3-day 90-mile riding test for artillery cavalry, and a 45-mile marching test for the infantry to assess the benefits of the new physical training program. So although there was no, as far as I know, super clear time standard, and it wasn't necessarily all about fitness as much as just testing units, that was the first thing I can point to in terms of like a fitness standard in the U.S. Army.
So true. If you back up to 1880, between 1885 and 1890, there were specified physical requirements for cadets at West Point in a myriad of physical activities like climbing walls and doing all these physical types of things, swimming. Those filtered out into the Army, and where an individual officer leader wanted to deploy some of those things, they did. But it was, General Order 44 and the repercussions of that, in particular Roosevelt and all the rest of those folks, who basically tried to standardize, and most of these were pass-fail types of events. So at one point in the 40s, there were a series of tests called piggyback tests or piggyback tests. And you were supposed to pick up a soldier, put them on your back and sprint 100, 150 yards. Well, there was a time standard, but what they actually did was they had two poles with a rope in between, and the rope was on the ground. And when the time standard hit, they pulled the rope up. And if you were past the rope, you passed. If you were on this side of the rope, you failed. They didn't record those scores, but the people on this side of the rope went to special pops PT and the others went somewhere else. So it was designed, these were mostly criterion referenced events. I think we were at a different time relative to, I don't know whether it's motivation or commitment or all of those types of things, that the idea that this was a pervasive problem just didn't exist. It was, people set standards and then people worked to achieve those standards. So there was not this necessary need for hierarchy in the scores.
So I want to catch up to 1920 and the stuff Drew was talking about. But before I do that, you used a term that I think is going to come up a few times in this discussion, and I want you to define it for the audience, but criterion referenced.
So we have norm reference standards and criterion reference standards. So norm reference standards are, I take a bunch of people, I do some type of assessment, and I establish those standards based on the distribution for that population or that sample. Criterion reference are, which is what the ACFT should have been, are standards, minimum standards that are pass or fail that allow you to accomplish whatever the task is. And so so I'll ask you a question. Tell me, I'm getting ready to go out to the range, and the range NCO comes up and is getting ready to in-brief us to the range. What things does he or she talk about? There's some very specific things that they talk about. 3 in particular that I can think of.
Task condition standards. I see where you're going here.
Okay, and the standards they aren't, to qualify with your weapon. I don't know what it is now. What is it? 19, 20, 21, whatever. That's the standard. It's a criterion reference standard. The irony is those are just made up. There's absolutely no science or anything behind that. And my assumption is we don't disenroll people who can't meet the marksmanship standard because we train them just the standard, which of course is what we should do with every task. But another story. So criterion reference it's embedded, it's imbued in everything the Army does because the Army is made up of tasks that have conditions and standards to them.
So again, I want to get back on track with the history of it, but I want to make a point that you got close to and didn't quite make, which is that if leaders identify that there is a problem with the current fitness levels of a population, it would seem inappropriate to then benchmark the scores based on the current performance of that population, which is the normatively referenced thing you were talking about there. It seems to me, and maybe I'm crazy, superficially obvious that if you're trying to change the fitness standards of that population, you would not decide what your standards are going to be based on how they can currently perform before you've implemented it. That just seems very odd.
So it's one of the mysteries of life. It's how can you? So I think the most disappointing thing about that is we punted before we gave things a chance. And what I believe is the vast majority of people, all compos, would have ultimately done just fine. I mean, to a large degree, we didn't change the floor. The passing score really didn't change all that much, except maybe a little bit on the 2-mile run. So, and the idea that how we talk about soldiers as a class and then have different standards based on sex it's anathema. It's an enigma, and there's no way to I think valid or have that be any type of a valid standard. So it's really it's just a problem. We should have done what the Canadians did. We could have handled it on the back end. We had a back end solution to the evaluations. People, this is the biggest conundrum of all. People cannot wrap their minds around the idea of measurement, evaluation. Personally, I do kind of, but I don't really care what you do with the data. Let's just collect all the data, and then you can make decisions about that data later. But when you tell people they only have to do 3 instead of 5, they're going to do 3, or some portion of the population. People talk about a third. And so that's really the problematic, because almost everyone working on this from the get-go talked about the new fitness test as being aspirational, that it was a standard a reasonable standard that we would set that all could and should aspire to, which would then in fact change the way we train.
So I have a feeling we will come back to some discussion of what happened with the ACFT, but I do want to keep us marching down this path of the history of Army fitness. And I'm going to go back to where Drew was, which is the 1920 manual and Raycroft and the things he was recommending. And again, just to baseline for the audience, Raycroft's recommendations were 2 physical training periods per day. The first one in the morning, but notably at least an hour and a half after breakfast. And that first session would have been personal conditioning, combatives, some things like that. And then another 1-hour afternoon session that would focus on athletics and sports and things like that. Or for training for what Drew mentioned, which is the individual efficiency test. And just to lay it out before I ask what your thoughts on it are, it's a 100-yard run with a 14-second standard, a running broad jump with a 12-foot standard, an 8-foot wall climb, a hand grenade throw 30 yards into a 10-foot diameter circle, and an obstacle course run, which, as far as I'm tracking, was the first recorded use of an obstacle course to obtain a quantitative assessment of physical fitness. And I think I have what was part of the obstacle course here: 5 obstacles over 100 yards, sprint 10 yards, vault a 3-foot hurdle, sprint 15 yards, negotiate a wire entanglement, sprint 15 yards, climb a 5-foot high ramp with a platform, leap from that platform over a 10-foot wide trench, sprint 15 yards, and negotiate a 1-foot wide, 20-foot long plank bridge. Another 15-yard sprint, climb over an 8-foot smooth-faced fence and sprint to the finish. And it'll sound like I just listed off a lot of things, but the standard was awfully fast here. We're talking like 30 seconds. Is that correct? I don't know.
It was well less than a minute. Yeah.
Yeah.
All of those things sound fast until I look at the kids that hold the record for the IOCT, and they do all that in 2 minutes, and it's much more complicated than this. So the only thing I think that isn't intuitive is Raycroft was coming out of Princeton. He was the chair of physical education, more or less, at that time. And intramurals were really catching on at that time. And there was a big belief that sport took all of those individual physical movements and melded and merged them together into some athletic act, which was instrumental in helping to smooth out the movement skills of soldiers. And also, they were sitting around for 4 hours a day, back to the play and grab ass thing, and they needed something to occupy their time. So it really was a good filler, and the men liked the sport types of things.
And another one we can kind of trace through time here, because obviously testing, what the test consisted of and what the standards were on the test, evolve as we go through this sine wave that you described earlier. And something that seems to follow that sine wave to a certain degree, it's outside the Army's control. It's very much in like society and public education's control, is the rate at which people who were drafted for the military were found unfit to serve. And we'll benchmark it here at World War I, and reports vary a little bit, but the general consensus is somewhere in the neighborhood of a third were rejected for being physically unfit to serve before they could be sworn into service. And I think we'll trace that to today, because that's in the news a lot today, is not that we're at the point of a draft by any means, but just the rate at which young people are eligible to join the military if they wanted to is an ongoing theme.
First of all, I don't think the records in 1917, 18, 19 were quite what they are during World War II or today. But in a lot of the literature I looked at, it was probably somewhere close to 40%. So about 60% were, I'm just going to use the term, medically qualified. And the interesting thing to me is by World War II, it was about 50%. We have that well documented. But the reasons changed pretty dramatically. We were more of an agrarian society in 1918. People were working in very hazardous industry types of jobs. They lost hands and fingers and feet and arms and legs, and believe it or not, a huge disqualifying factor was dental. I really think a lot about the folks who are having problems with being able to deploy because they haven't done their dental work. But in World War I, they didn't have any teeth, and they wouldn't draft someone or admit someone who didn't have teeth. So by World War II, it was different. It was more of a fitness issue than it was. Still some of that, but yeah, that was exactly correct. And now we're at about 2.3, so 6 out of 10, 5 out of 10. Now we're at about 2.3, 2.4. And what a group of us argued starting back in 2010 was, when we get below 2.5, you can't man the force. And we haven't met our manning requirements for the last probably 5 or 6 years.
So I'll hit a quick note on interwar because we're getting really close to World War II era changes to fitness and testing and stuff. But I think the thing that stood out to me, and this goes with the sine wave thing of boom and bust when it comes to caring about fitness, is that in 1928, the Army just kind of summarily threw out all the work that Raycroft did and that the Commission on Training Camp Activities did, and they just threw out physical fitness testing as a measure of combat readiness entirely. Since you brought it up, I think there's a conversation to have here. And this is something I worry about a lot. And I've talked about it with a few different audiences. I think I've mentioned it on this podcast before, but I worry a little bit that in this community of people that are affiliated with the military or like really care about the military for personal reasons and things like that, it is easy to message that we need to worry about fitness as a society so that we can man the force. What I worry is that in an era where war doesn't seem as immediate a threat or something people need to be concerned about, I don't know how many people in like society at large, the messaging about we need to be able to man the force, I don't know how well it resonates with enough people to really change policy at a national level. But I would also argue that there are countless other reasons to care about physical education in our public schools, whether it's ability of kids to focus in the classroom and learn, whether it's the mental health of teenagers, whether it's the affordability of public health care because people that are fit and healthy are cheaper to insure. I wonder if we're like over messaging the military component of this, and maybe that's because of the community I'm in and the bubble I'm in that I hear it so much, but I do wonder if that is something that is going to convince policymakers and voters who may not be quite as concerned about military readiness as the people that are actually in the military.
Yeah, I don't know what the current numbers are of individuals serving who had a parent that served or a family member that served, but my assumption is it's very small. So that legacy effect, and that for all intent and purposes, we haven't had a mass mobilization to fight. I suppose I don't even know if you could count Vietnam. So certainly it happened in World War II. I believe there may well be more of an emphasis on it relative to healthcare costs and, you know, type 1, type 2 diabetes, obesity. I don't think folks have inherently linked it to learning and cognition and those types of things, although there's plenty of evidence going back to the 70s in Japan about what the benefits are of physical activity. So yeah, I hope that I don't think it's being oversold, because I think it's being to a certain degree sold to a certain population. So I've been incredibly disappointed with the President's Council the last 25 or 30 years. I think they've abrogated their responsibilities, and I think we'll pay for it at some point in the future. So we'll see. If Ukraine spills over, you know, all bets off.
Can I ask, so again, going from World War I to World War II, you talked about this transition from this disciplinary gymnastics model that Kohler introduced to this Raycroft athletic sport model. And I think Alex mentioned, you know, eventually even moving away from that. But what did it look like going from a gymnastics type thing to a athletic sport type model? And then what changes did we see into World War II?
So so what's the favorite activity at the War College?
PowerPoints?
Yeah, that'd be softball. And so that athletic model has really never diminished that much or gone away. And there's a lot to be said for certain sports relative to pledging together the components of physical fitness and helping to smooth out the movement aspects of it. And I don't mean to downplay that. I think the problem that we have in the United States today that is as problematic as youth fitness is specialization in sport at an early age. We have individuals who have never done anything but play tennis or play golf or play football or any of that. And unless you're in a sport like lacrosse or soccer or, you know, some of those types of basketball, maybe, unless you're in those types of sports, it's pretty much, you know, uniplanar types of movements. I'm only moving this way or this way. I can't do multiplanar types of things, and I can't express power in the way I need to express power because I've only done it in this manner. So you know, when I grew up in the 60s, if you didn't play 3 different sports, if you played sports, you were kind of the odd person out. You played football or ran cross country in the fall, played basketball or wrestled in this winter, and, you know, did baseball or track and field or something in the spring, tennis. But we don't let our kids do that anymore, and that's really unfortunate. So I think the sport things are good. I think it's, you know, I don't know about it in a unit setting as much as in a basic training environment. I think it's good as long as we can fit it in around the training. And I'm afraid the rucksack is so full that we can't put anything else in it, and we're pitching out some of the training opportunities just because we've got so much else that we have to do, especially, you know, at the Army Training Center. So athletics never really diminished after it kind of started in the 20s and 30s and 40s.
So I'll start bridging the gap here to the World War II discussion. So laying groundwork again a little bit. 1936, we're talking about Basic Field Manual 21-20 that stayed in place for quite a long time. Still recommending 2 sessions per day. One that was looking at that after breakfast time frame, consisting primarily of individual exercise and gymnastics, and then afternoon kind of looking at specifically bayonet training, but also athletics and games and things like that. But what's particularly noteworthy here is that that manual is the first time running received any particular focus in an Army fitness manual, and echoes today that I think this is a direct quote from that manual from 1936. On account of its severity and tendency to permanent injury, instructors are cautioned to proceed carefully, especially when handling green men. So an awareness that, like, careful progression and managing, like, to meet the individual where they are and progress them from there is crucial. Otherwise, you're going to run really quickly into injury issues. And that's nearly 100 years ago. And we're struggling with an identical problem today.
Yeah, I concur. You know, especially back in the 30s and 40s, people just didn't run, period. I mean, I think people run a lot more today than they did back then. And it's one of the reasons we have tests like the OPAT to help young recruits understand, you know, how important anaerobic and aerobic, you know, fitness is, and how they need to work on that before they get to basic training. So hopefully we're smarter than we were back then. And the ACFT has changed that dynamic a lot, because I could probably survive running 6 days a week in basic training 10 years ago, because I could nug out enough push-ups and sit-ups to pass. Can't do that with sprint drag carry. Can't do that with you know, the deadlift. I just can't. So I think a lot of the initial entry training injury reductions that we've seen, which almost always were linked to running, is that we're not running as much. So,
and so to get through this a little bit, we've got, I'll drop a quote from Colonel Roundtree that appears in your book. He was the medical director for the Selective Service. And this is, I'm not sure. So this is as we're drafting for World War II. His quote is, "We are accustomed to regard ourselves as a nation as healthy and rugged. But when we look at the facts as they are revealed by the statistics on rejection, a very large portion of our manhood is far below par." And this is where we're talking about that 50% rejection rate thing. And once again, an echo to present day stuff we've got going on. Based on that rejection rate, they realized that they needed some kind of action to meet the manpower requirements. And their first shot at it was to try and rehabilitate medically disqualified recruits. That kind of went out the window because it wasn't terribly successful. So instead, they chose a prehabilitation program to address the greater physical fitness problem. So I find people who the reason they couldn't join was they couldn't meet the fitness standards and try and get them to those fitness standards. And it's funny to see people act like the future soldier prep course that's in the news lately is a brand new thing. It's not even the first time we've done it in my Army career, but it's certainly not the first time the Army has tried to get like a little bit farther upstream and get people to the fitness standard before they join, because we're looking at it right here in World War II.
Yeah, I was always impressed with the Australian Army, and they do a pre-assessment at home station and then report to Kapuka. And when they get there, they take that same test over again. And if they don't pass to standard, and they're 2 standard deviations below, they go to a 4-week training program. If they pass within 1 standard deviation, they go to a 7-day training program to try to, get to that pass mark. I mean, it especially as those numbers start to wane, it's going to be important that we have those types of programs available to young people. So
you also mentioned earlier that part of the logic with the OPAT is to like make it clear to people who are trying to serve like what they need to work on. And I think we struggle with this with both potential like people who are considering joining and people who are already in uniform. The stated purpose of the fitness test, and you've mentioned this a couple times, is for commanders to know how fit their formation is and to be able to identify what people who are struggling need to work on specifically. And I've asked at this point hundreds of soldiers, potentially into the 4 digits now, have you ever, after your fitness test, been sat down by your leadership and had a conversation about where you performed well, where you didn't perform, and what kinds of training you should be doing to improve on the places you were struggling? And the number who say yes, they have had that conversation is like passingly small. Like it's a rarity to hear that anyone has ever had that conversation. And that it's frustrating to me because like we're not doing fitness tests just to do tests because they're fun, right? They're supposed to serve a purpose for leadership to design training based on the results. And it seems like that's clearly not happening. So how do we figure that piece out of getting leadership to understand that they should be making decisions based on the results of the test, not just going back to exactly what they were doing going into that test?
Yeah, I've had enough experience with the Army to appreciate to a certain degree the complexities of company command, battalion command, brigade command, to understand a little bit of the nuance and a little bit of the, day-to-day tempo. And it's what always surprised me a little bit about the idea of we're going to put this wearable on that's going to create a dashboard that the battalion commander can sit down and look at every day and look who's green and who's red. I don't see that as a real viable solution. I have to say that I believe, and I believed it from the very beginning, that this can only happen through the holistic health and fitness process. and we have a group of individuals at a large enough mass that they can reach down and take those individual soldiers who need help in a particular area and then develop that training model that becomes insinuated in the unit model. And we do this a little bit again with special pops or when we're rehabilitating, but there's no reason that we can't have a situation where a couple of days a week we're doing strength and power, a couple of days a week we're doing cardio, and then there's kind of a wild card day. If you need some extra work with strength and power, we can push you in this direction. If you need some special work with anaerobic or aerobic, we can push you in this direction. I don't believe anyone currently serving in the unit is going to be able to do that until we get to the point where we have a full-time master fitness trainer who is in that unit and that's their only job. I believe that'll come, but it's probably going to be 4 or 5 years away, I think.
Is there historical context for that idea of, if you fail a test, say World War I, World War II, even pre-World War I, like, was there any conversation around, okay, this soldier failed, here's what he's going to do to train to pass the test? Or was this test concept just something that you did, and if you failed, you failed? Because I mean, you mentioned H2F and this idea of individualized training plans, working with somebody who's very well educated around how to improve X, Y, and Z based on your results. But like, I don't hear many stories or any stories really of like a soldier in the 1930s or 40s failing one of these tests and then getting training specific to help them pass the next time around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I really think there was. I think the idea behind this, Alex mentioned this a minute ago. So it was, can you do your job? And the other part of that is that I didn't mention earlier was, if in fact we've created a training program that ultimately allows you to be successful in doing your job as a soldier, we're going to use this measurement to see where you are, to benchmark you against that, but it's also to validate the training program. So there's some special training that needs to go on, but there may need to be a systemic kind of change in the overall training program. Yeah, I would have to go back and look at the FMs, but I'm positive that at some point in the FMs there was some discussion about what happens when you fail, and it wasn't you get demoted, and it wasn't you get kicked out. It was just some special emphasis in terms of the training. So
I just remember, you look at Field Manual 722, the most recent iteration of it, and it's very clear, like there's programming laid out, and good, bad, or otherwise, like somebody could go in there and say, okay, here's what I'm going to do to improve. But when I look back at some of these older manuals, it's essentially a series of exercises that you're sort of meant to just fall into alongside a dozen, 100, 1,000 of your peers, and you move through this kind of collective fitness regimen. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. Like, inevitably people are going to fail these benchmark tests as we start to create benchmark tests. But is there ever a follow-on conversation about like, okay, this group is going to focus on speed power, this group is going to focus on, endurance, whatever it might be. It's just an interesting kind of historical context around, if you fail, how do you then train to improve?
So what I would argue is that in the 30s, 40s, 50s, those types of things, it became a volume game.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you were not passing the test, you did PT. And of course, the most bizarre notion of all, and it goes directly back to the Turners, is the idea of doing PT in an extended rectangular formation. I mean, it's just, I don't even know how to describe it.
It's industrial.
It makes no sense at all. And a little bit of that we have to remember was designed to ensure that soldiers instantly followed verbal commands and orders. I can remember a commandant when I first went to West Point say, on Humma Humma drill number 4, repetition number 2, that soldier's hand was in the wrong position. And I'm going, oh my God, you're a 1-star general, and anyway. I all of that is self-defeating. It's not going to get us to where we go, because it automatically gets dumbed down to the lowest common denominator. But I think what happened in the time period you're describing is, you know, I did PT on Saturday and Sunday. I didn't do athletics in the afternoon. I did PT in the morning and in the afternoon, which may have been problematic in terms of overuse injuries and those types of things. But what we didn't do is we didn't kick people out. And although we don't kick, for all intent and purposes, we don't kick people out now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think remedial PT was the answer to that. What my hope is that going forward, that we'll have the right people in the right place, who can say, you know, we need to bring our strength and conditioning folks in, and our dietitian in, and our sports psychologist in, and we need to have a group discussion about why East can't pass the sprint rec carrier or whatever. I can't pass. So, and then while we're training, again, I think there's enough latitude in the training, you know, program model where you can, you know, shunt people off to a little bit of extra training.
So I'm kind of liking the structure here that we've fallen into, which is kind of like go through a little bit of history, then pause for some good conversations about how it ties to today. So what I'm going to do next is move us fairly quickly through the World War II era,
Okay.
and knock out a couple of testing evolutions that happened there, because I think it leads to an interesting conversation about like what pressures actually change tests. But in the 1941 timeframe, you've got Colonel Bank, who brought in Charles McCoy and A.A. Esslinger to develop a new test. And I don't know if there's a whole sidebar to go down here about whatever methods they used to determine what physical measures associated with combat readiness, because that sounds very much like the work you had to do on the ACFT. But what they found, the 10 fitness items they found that best discriminated, according to them, between fit and unfit soldiers were pull-ups, 20 seconds max burpees, 3 consecutive broad jumps known as the triple bound, shot put, push-ups, 75-yard buddy carry run. I think they were still calling it the piggyback run there. Dodging run, 6-second run, which I assume is just a 6-second sprint, sit-ups, and a 300-yard run. This was supposed to feed into an experimental conditioning study where they would test what types of training best improved those measures, theoretically best improving combat readiness. But this was preempted by operational needs. They were shortening basic training at this time. They were just trying to mass produce soldiers, so they didn't get to quite go down the road they were hoping for. But what they ended up with was the Army Ground Forces test, the AGFT. And that included several of those events and a couple of different ones, but push-ups, 300-yard shuttle run, 20-second burpees, 70-yard buddy carry run with a man of equal weight, 70-yard zigzag run. And it sounds like that was a little more complicated than that. It involved crawling and jumping and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then a 4-mile march. And although the AGFT was encouraged, it was not mandatory. And that's something that is a theme in a lot of these older fitness tests, is that they came up with a cool test. It wasn't necessarily tied to like policy and enforceability. It was just a tool out there for commanders to potentially use. I'll roll through this so we can knock out some of the history going on at the same time frame, because World War II is going on and society is motivated by service to the military and things like that. You've got the Victory Corps physical education program going on. Like 70% of high schools across the entire country had at least tried it, and more than half had adopted it as their physical education program. That's pretty huge adoption across society. It included a menu of fitness assessments, and teachers were encouraged to select like no more than 3 from each category for a total of 10 events. That has echoes of something Drew and I have discussed on previous episodes of a testing world where it was a menu of events and commanders or whoever it was could pick the ones that were appropriate, maybe on the day of, maybe a few weeks ahead of time, whatever.
Sound like my cadets. Go ahead.
I will pause to ask you, with your scar tissue of going through the bureaucratic process of going from like a test that's been validated scientifically to one that is validated bureaucratically, is there any world in which that like choose your own adventure testing situation could ever become policy? Is that even like remotely something that could be dealt with?
So there was a huge tempest pushback on the idea of 6 events. We originally started with 8, and the CSA was not your problem. You just tell me what the science is and we'll figure it out. And I was like, okay, if that's where you want to go. It could take a couple of hours. His response was, I don't care if it takes a week. It's that important. And I'm like, okay. So the pushback, I think, came from individual soldiers on the ground. And by that, I mean platoon sergeant or drill sergeant. The tasks that they're required to do, both administratively and operationally, and all of those tasks, in my estimation, have become rather onerous. So the interest in anything more complex than kind of what we're doing now is I think a potential problem. I mentioned cadets. It's ironic. We had the first graduate class of Kines majors at West Point, and we assigned them this project as a senior project, and that's exactly what they came up with, was a menu of like 25 items. And 30 days before you tested, they picked one anaerobic test, they picked one aerobic test, they picked one of this and one of that. My concern after going through the development of the testing manual and listening for days and weeks and months to people tell me how difficult it was to administer 6 events, it worries me that anything more complex would be just a bridge too far.
I do wonder so like background for listeners, I was at the physical fitness school trying to help with like the field version of implementation of this while Dr. East was at the headquarters dealing with the bureaucratic version of implementation of this thing. And if we could simply live in a world where the Army read the event and kind of got the intent of it and stopped worrying about how many ways there are to game it and screw it up and mess with it and just like not do it the way they know they're supposed to do it. If we could just say like 300-yard shuttle, run your foot crosses the line, go. And like the Army would be okay with that, instead of writing out like 60 ridiculous clarifications of like how much of your foot crosses the line and how thick the line is and how far apart the lines have to be and like how to lay, like we kill ourselves on this stuff, and it is incredibly infuriating on like how bad the Army just wants to like find ways to not do what the intent was when they all know what the intent was in the first place.
So the irony is I got people on either ends of this bimodal spectrum, because let's just take the hand release push up. You know, I got people talking about the arms and where the arms had to go, and I would have 5 NCOs go, you know, whatever. They just move your hands somewhere. And then I had people writing me saying, I want you to get a goniometer, and I want you to tell me the exact degrees of extension at the shoulder and the elbow, so that anyway. So yeah, my assumption is that's, so here's where we made a huge mistake. We kept the same PT test for 40 years. It was a huge mistake. The Army never did that before. Even if they only changed one event, people knew things were going to change. And the idea that we kept a subpar test for 40 years is really an indictment. And is the ACFT the greatest test ever invented? No. Should it be changed? Yes. When should it be changed? It should be being changed right now. I mean, on a 5-year term, we should be changing it. And so I hope we don't get stuck in that model again.
Just thinking through that, like it seems, and I realize when we look at history, oftentimes it's through rose-colored glasses and there's a romanticism to it. And when we think about physical testing and physical culture for, you know, World War II and World War I, like it's all kind of super motivated dudes in chucks and short shorts, like crushing, you know, everything, and they're so fit. But like, how did we get to this point where physical training and physical testing in the military is so politicized and so muddy? And so, I mean, is it because we have this like data driven conversation now? I mean, your point about the goniometer, and like, is it, you know, a certain, like, how did we get to this point where it's just so messy, or has it always been that messy and we just don't talk about it?
So let me preface my next comment by saying we can't have an Army without women in it. So everybody just needs to get over that. When 1978, 79, when we were starting to make that move to do away with the Women's Army Corps and to bring women into the Army, there were 2 groups of men. There were paternal dudes and there were stupid dudes. That was the 2 groups. And the stupid ones had absolutely no idea what the physical capabilities and capacities of women were. One of my favorite NCOs just posted this morning that she's taken her 99th ACFT or whatever it is and scored a 583. Well, even on the scale that she's on now, a 583 is still a hell of a deal. It's a level of fitness that, so we have that problem, and I think it still persists a little bit today. And I think there are individuals, you know, who think that there are groups that need to be protected, and that this is just, you know, I can't tell you the number of times I heard the word fair. This is just not fair. Well, it's not supposed to be fair. It's supposed to be an assessment. We want to try to level the playing field for everyone for everything, and that's just not the way life is, and it's not the way military tasks are, and it's not the way combat is. Anyway, I think that was part of the problem, and we also do that across compos. Well, it's not fair to the guard or fair to the reserve or whatever. And I know a lot of guard guys that will crush anyone you want to bring forward.
I will rapidly help us catch up through a little bit of testing evolution here. We were talking about the AGFT that evolved slightly to the physical efficiency test battery, ditched the zigzag run, ditched the road march, but notably was the first time scoring scales became a thing. I'm sure we could talk for a while on that one, but I'm going to kind of keep rolling to a certain degree.
It was very innocuous, though. Let me just tell you, there was a lot of discussion about standards and scoring, and almost to a senior leader, this is going to be a good thing because it's going to reward the high achievers. And I'm not sure what they were thinking about the people who weren't high achievers, but anyway, I don't think it worked out exactly like they wanted it to be.
Well, why, before Alex goes on, why all of a sudden did we decide we needed to have scoring?
So this is anecdotal, and this is my belief. I'm not necessarily.
You're more qualified than we are, so
I don't think I could support this other than I think it's one of the very few things in life, and in particular military life, where there is a validated process, lane, start, finish, standard, and it affects everybody the same way. Almost everything else, it's like with the indoor obstacle course at West Point, after I'd been there a couple of years, I wrote into the testing manual, when you start the IOCT, only two things can happen. You will pass or you will fail. There are no other alternatives. And and they were like, well, what if I get hurt? Then you fail because you fail to train properly. Well, what happens if I die? Then you fail because you didn't complete the test in the time requirement. And so I think it became a standard because everything else was much more subjective, and doing physical activities were about as objective as we can get. And so people wanted to use that. They wanted to piggyback on that because we all know that anyone that can score 300 on an APFT is a great soldier. Well, we know that's not true, but some are, I'm sure. But anyway. So.
All right. Moving through, there were actually kind of a bunch of tests at this time period. There was like an indoor version, an outdoor version, just kind of a bunch of stuff going on. One thing I noted is that tests were recommended to be conducted every 8 to 12 weeks, very different from once or twice a year. Let's see, I'm gonna kind of roll. Actually, the next kind of big event I have on the chronology, and this gets into if anybody's watched The Motivation Factor and learned about like the La Sierra High School PE program and things like that, we're getting close to that. But a formative event in the history of American fitness and led directly to the President's Council and things like that was the Krause-Weber test. And I guess rather than me trying to make something up, I'm just going to ask you what your thoughts are on like first off, how valid the Krause-Weber test was, like methodology stuff going on in there, and then just kind of the legacy it left on fitness in America.
How about what is the Krause-Weber test first?
That's a good start for the audience. I can lay out a little bit and then let Dr. East go. The bottom line is...
Tell them the events first.
Yeah.
Yeah, the short version of the Krause-Weber test is that they put together this like battery of test events. I don't honestly remember what most of them are. I know like sit-up is on there, a couple other things, but when they ran around testing American kids and they ran around testing European kids. And the failure rate among the European kids was 8.7%. And the failure rate among the American kids they tested was 57.9%. So a massive disparity between the two. So
lash yourself to the mast. Per se, the Krause-Weber test is stupid. I mean, it's just so everything was one repetition, right? So one of the events was, can you touch your toes? Yes. Can you do a sit-up? Yes. Can you do a prone lift that was whatever
the Superman thing where you put your hands
behind? Yes, yeah, that's correct. So it plays way above the level of physical assessment. And by virtue of the fact that the majority of the kids in Europe had been playing soccer or other types of of ball sports like that, and a lot of our kids hadn't, there were significant decrements in flexibility and a little bit in strength. And so I was kind of making light of it, but it as a test, it really didn't do anything to measure physical fitness. But what it did do in a very succinct way, and there's a great backstory with Eisenhower and the physiotherapist Bonnie Pruden and all that crew who worked with Krause. They got into the White House, and when they did, it just rolled. They went straight to the President's Council. The American Association of Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance was heavily involved in it, and it became a real national movement. And I think a lot of really good things happened. And then AFERD came up with a pretty decent fitness test. And there were a plethora of tests during that period by independent organizations, AFERD, AAU, and then Cooper and all that bunch started in with their tests. So, yeah.
How much does and this is just a random thought that I had as you were talking about the multitude of tests, but how much does the evolution of our physiological understanding of human performance tend to influence military testing? Because when we look back historically, it seems like a lot of the events and the formats are being dictated by people who say, hey, this makes sense given what we know and have experienced about combat. Physiologically, the order or the events may not make any sense, but it seems like now the discussions are a lot more about, hey, we need to have a speed power component. Hey, we need to have an aerobic component. Hey, we need to have an anaerobic. Like, how much has that evolution of our understanding of science dictated or steered the conversation about what we think is appropriate for a military fitness test?
So, great question. Couple thoughts. One of the things that I failed to do, and I don't take credit for this, thanks Dr. Bill Breshew, who came up with this idea, is we need to be looking at things more or less in terms of intensity, and we need to put things into three buckets. We need to put them into the physical intensity bucket, the motor and movement intensity bucket, and the structural bucket. And in reality, the structural bucket has to come first. I mean, what's the first thing we do with kids in basic training is we break them somehow. It's either soft tissue or hard tissue, and we break them sometimes irreparably, while we're trying to train the physical, which then is going to inform the movement types of things. So where I fall on this is you have to kind of put those things in order. We have to do low resistance, higher repetition, repetitive types of events, activities that improve structural integrity, soft tissue and hard tissue types of things. Also helps maybe a little bit with static balance and all those other types of things. Then I can do the high intensity, low intensity physical types of things. Then I can take that bucket of structure and physical and use that to inform the military movement types of things. The problem that we had was we had a 3-event test and no one was training in any type of comprehensive manner. They were doing a couple of push-ups, they were doing a couple of sit-ups, and they were running a lot. And one of the mandates that we had with the ACFT was to create, what are the components of fitness? And you can argue those all you want to. But when you look at strength and endurance, muscular strength and endurance, and you look at power, and then you look at aerobic endurance and anaerobic endurance, anaerobic power, maybe if you want to use that term, then what you have is this nexus that you need to train. And the mandate was that we select events that required, that forced comprehensive training, because we know that when we train comprehensively, and we spent a lot of time with the Ranger Regiment, we spent a lot of time with Special Forces guys and gals, and they were way ahead of the curve, vice the regular Army, for a lot of reasons. You know, they had landed on this. Go back and look at the original raw assessments. I mean, look at what they were. There was no science behind those. There were a bunch of operators that got in a room and said, hey, we got to have a strong core. We got to have a really be able to work off ground, upper body. We've got to be able to do, you know, carry a lot of resistance on our legs and have high strength in our legs. And so they had pull-ups and they had leg tucks and they had deadlifts and they had all those kind of events. And they were pretty close. They were pretty close to what the science told us. So the idea wasn't so much that there was one aspect of fitness that we needed to focus on as much as we needed to do things that were more comprehensive. So I think our failure so far, and it was one of the things that the CSA asked us to do, which we failed, was to come back with an obstacle course type event that would be given off cycle to the ACFT that would wrap all these together into the movement, the dynamic balance, like, you know, agility, coordination, all those types of things. So go back and look at the original German test, the Dutch test. You know, the Danes, I think they had like 13 items. And so I think the comprehensive nature of it's really important.
Is it safe to say maybe that the motivation for test design in the modern age is more about driving effective and comprehensive training, like you just mentioned? And what I mean by that is, like with the ACFT, one of the things that you see all the time is, now that you have these components, you know, this deadlift component, it's not just push-ups, sit-ups, and a run. Now you see soldiers training better. They're going after training more effectively. Is that what's driving testing these days? Or is it still, hey, let's assemble the best sequence of events so that we can, and I'll use the term mimic here, that may not be the best term, but so that we can mimic combat and prepare soldiers for combat? That's kind of where my head is at, but does that make sense?
No, and I'm not sure you can split those cleanly.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
What I would argue is, so let me ask you a question. How often do NFL players do the combine? How often do they do that? Every year, twice a year?
Once, ever.
Okay, why? Why do they only do the combine once?
I have so many thoughts on this, but I think the right answer would be because it's effectively their benchmark for whether or not you're going to be good as a football player pre-draft.
Yeah, but why don't they do it next year for bonuses, or the next year for promotions? Or
that's a great question.
So my opinion is because they have a sports physiotherapist, an athletic trainer, a massage therapist, orthopedic doc, and a strength and conditioning and a mobility coach. And they train and assess them every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so where I was headed to with the ACFT is, if H2F was fully implemented at the level that it should be, we wouldn't need an ACFT.
Mm-hmm.
Because you would have trained eyes on those soldiers every day, and you would be able to make those changes to help that soldier develop more or less every day. Okay, Guard and Reserve, we have to figure that out. But so I think having that assessment solves all of those issues. And I think I'm pretty pleased with where we got to in the ACFT, sans the leg tuck. But I think that I don't know of anyone who scores over 500 on that test who can't perform almost every military skill or task that I can think of. Maybe there is, but so I think that's really a good accomplishment.
So given how long we've been going already, I'm going to accelerate rapidly through some history here that I'll just kind of let people know is in the book if they want to go dig it up.
You do want to dig it up. Trust me. It's good.
You sure do. We're getting close to, actually, I guess I'll state it. 4 times from 1885 to 1970, various Army committees recommended that the Army develop and resource a school to train officers and NCOs about physical fitness. That is close to my heart because that is what ended up becoming the U.S. Army Physical Fitness School.
4 times? Did those coincide with like 4 big? Because I'm thinking World War I, World War II. No,
they coincided with like assembling councils to look into how to fix problems, right? Yep. And sometimes that was President's Council related stuff. Sometimes like Benning got a bunch of people together. Like various councils were assembled in that.
Sorry, sidetracked you.
No, that's a common one. We're not going to go, I think, too deep into that history, and I don't know how many people super much care about the history of the Army Physical Fitness School and it getting shut down and coming back and things like that. But if that's your thing, tons of that in the book. There's a whole annex or appendix, I think, that like specifically marks out like the key events. The test continued to evolve. So like Krauss-Weber, you're talking about Korea timeframe a little bit here too. Dr. East already mentioned Task Force Smith and like all the commanders from Korea screaming about how fitness was a hugely limiting factor in performance in that conflict. Though, as far as I can tell, all those commanders screaming about it and talking about it didn't really influence that much what the Army was doing about it on an institutional level. So that's a little bit troubling.
Wait, let me pause you there because I had a question, and this was not to take us back into the history books again, but I remember, I forget which time frame we were at when you had this in the book, but it was a comment about how senior leaders, it's usually senior leaders who are the biggest dissidents when it comes to new tests because they can't meet the standard. And I would just be curious if you have a comment on that. Just, historically, that always seems to be one of the issues is a new test comes up and the senior leadership knows that they can't pass this new test. And so they fight it and, rinse and repeat, wait till the next generation rolls through.
So this assessment evolved in a very precarious way, and I would argue without the drive and tenacity of General Milley, this wouldn't have been successfully implemented. And basically, it really wasn't senior leaders who were concerned about it, because if you go back and look at the Army pyramid, especially, NCOs and officers, by the time you get to USASMA or the time you get to the War College, you've been through so many wickets, and the physical one was always one of those wickets. And those people generally understood that and were successful in all of those. It was the mid-level, really the kind of the field grade bubbas. It was really the majors and the lieutenant colonels who were like, just one anecdote, non-attributional. I was at Fort Knox and we were doing a workshop, and I literally had some folks on their knees almost with tears in their eyes that my career is over. I've scored 300 on 27 consecutive APFTs, and now my life's over. Of course, none of that was true, but they had been in the Army for a hot minute and they didn't know anything else. And that unknown was scary for a lot of people. I'm sure they all did just fine, but I don't honestly think that was a significant factor in how the test ultimately played out. So certainly not from the very top.
Mm-hmm.
Those folks were supportive. General Townsend was just a beast. I mean, he was after this from day one, so the real help. So
I'll do a fast sidebar and then get back on track. But Dr. East just mentioned General Townsend being a beast. I have not had a chance to meet him in person. I exchanged a couple messages with him.
Big time
briefly.
listener. Shout out General Townsend. I have no clue if he listens.
One might hope. I did let him know that this exists because some may have noted, like the tagline for Mops and Mo's is changing the fitness culture of the force, and that was a sentence that resonated with me since the first day I read it, which was the day I walked into the Army Physical Fitness School, and like pinned to the wall was the annual training guidance from General Townsend. And like priority number one on the annual training guidance was change the fitness culture of the force. Like not super specific, just like a line in the sand of like, we're going to do something about this. And that has stuck with me ever since.
He was pretty amazing.
So a couple interesting notes. If you read the book, once you get to like the 70s era, you'll start to realize that like the development of the ACFT, realistically, depending on where you trace the starting point to, could be traced that far back. When we talk about, it's like gender neutral fitness standards. When did that emerge? Well, in 1977, the Army Vice Chief of Staff directed the Army to study the impact of gender-free physical standards that could be used for MOS selection and assignment. We had another one of those big meetings here. Like General Starry got a bunch of people together for another one of those Army councils, talked about a bold initiative to modernize. At the same time, and Dr. East goes into this deeply in the book, but talking about the like Cooper Institute influence, the Nautilus influence, everything that was happening with like societal level fitness stuff that is going on. We're getting really close to the establishment of the APFT as we know it here. This is also the same time frame that we finally got like some investment in formalizing fitness school stuff. When the fitness school was first established, it was 3 officers, 1 non-commissioned officer, 2 civilians, and the budget was $87,000. Fast forward just a few years, and it was 32 officers, 28 NCOs, 38 civilians, and an annual budget of $6 million. So anybody who's been involved in the fitness school space knows that it actually, this is going to lead me to 3 questions I got to ask Dr. East directly. First question, has the fitness school lived up to what it was originally imagined to be for the Army?
So that's it. My answer will seem pejorative, but you have to understand the context. On or about 1989, 88, 89, there were some significant bracks and budget cuts and things like that. And basically they neutered the fitness school. And so to expect them to live up to where they were in 85 or to return to that level, that's never happened. And the interesting thing to me was the infantry school was always hovering in the background. And anytime somebody dropped the fitness ball, the infantry school picked it up. And they picked it up in, they were going to just do away with the fitness school. And the infantry school said, no, we'll take it. And so it moved back down to Benning, now Fort Moore. So my basic answer is no, but they couldn't have lived up to it based on the funding and support that they.
All right. Second, very direct question here, which is that if you look at like the APFT as we knew it until pre-ACFT timeframe, and I look through all these other tests that happened in the timeframe leading up to it, those run times on the APFT that I grew up with in the Army were, as far as I can tell, the fastest run times of like any test implemented for the Army. We had other tests that were looking for like an 8 to 8.5 minute 1 mile, or like a 19-minute 2 mile, or various other things. How good do you think? I don't know. This comes back to criteria normed versus performance normed and things like that. But did those run times make sense? Are the ACFT run times we have now way too slow, or were the APFT run times a little too fast? And I'll throw in a nugget from your book that I did not realize. General Schwarzkopf considered the APFT standards too stringent. I thought that was an interesting little nugget. But I guess what's your take on the APFT standards as they were? And we can throw out that the events were probably not the right events to be testing, but that's a whole separate conversation.
So I fall back to VO2, really. And I think there's a kind of a minimal level of VO2, or sort of a VO2 range. And the issue that we have is there are X amount of hours in the day, X amount of days in the week, yada, yada, for people to train. And if I overtrain in one area or spend more time in one area, then I'm not training in all the areas that I think soldiers need to be training in. So I'm a pretty big fan of somewhere between 45 to 55 mLs per kg in terms of a VO2 range, which is probably in a range from about 14 minutes to about 18 or 19 minutes, probably about 18 minutes. So I think the average soldier ought to be able to run 2 miles in that period of time. With that said, tying it on to the end of the ACFT, with rounding error, should probably add about a minute onto the time. And the reason I say that is because we went out to second bat at Fort Lewis and tested a bunch of high-speed Rangers out there, and the delta in their 2 mile run time for their last APFT and the 2 mile run time for the ACFT. And I can unequivocally say I didn't need to motivate anyone at all to do their best, was about 46 seconds. So average population, I'm just rounding out to a minute. So if we had people running in that 15 to 19 minute range, I think we would be in really good shape in the Army. Do I need someone to run an 11:30 2 mile? Okay, if there was some article the other day about a CrossFitter guy who was, did y'all see that? I can't remember what it was. He was like deadlifting 500 pounds and ran a 5-minute mile. And
oh yeah,
it's like, what? That was crazy. But I was just thinking, if you can do that, then run an 11-minute 2 mile at the end of an ACFT. But until you can max the other, 5 events, then work on the other 5 events and accept your VO2 at a level that's going to make you successful. And we also underestimate anaerobic endurance, anaerobic fitness in the Army. We don't, because you keep getting that, oh yeah, when I have to run a mile in combat, I'll train to run a mile because I've never run a mile in combat. But what people don't understand is energy metabolism. They don't understand what happens in that 60 seconds between a 3 to 5 second rush and I have to climb over a wall. They don't understand what their aerobic capacity does for them in terms of energy generation. So,
and my final really direct one here, and this kind of like rattled me because I had no idea this existed until I saw this comment from your book. So I'm basically just asking a verification question here. The first part of the sentence was something I already knew, which is that in 1983, the Master Fitness Trainer course was a 4-week resident course taught at Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, by qualified fitness professionals. That was all history I was tracking. The second part was it was also part of AIT at the 03 Charlie Military Occupational Specialty, which was an MOS called Physical Activity Specialist.
mm-hmm.
Huh.
So is that to say that in the 80s we did in fact have an MOS for fitness trainers?
No. So, and I don't mean to denigrate any MOS or anything, but the 03 Charlie was kind of like the guy at the fitness center who was kind of handing out towels and basketballs. And that doesn't mean that when a soldier or a civilian came in and said, I need some help with my deadlift, that they couldn't go help them. But that really wasn't their job. They were kind of facility managers with this kind of ancillary responsibility. So yeah, you in AIT they had to go through that 4-week course, and I'm sure there are some that were amazing and used all of that information, but it really wasn't their primary duty.
Fair enough. I think so. Like full disclosure for both you, Dr. East, and the audience here, I had 13 pages of notes going into this conversation. From going through the book, I had all sorts of stuff. There's a lot of goodness in here. As far as the history, by getting up to 1983, there was from our last comment. The General Schwarzkopf comment on APFT standards was 1987, and 1987 brings us to General Hertling getting involved. And I won't necessarily go too far down this one because I have a feeling this is where like a lot of the second edition of Dr. East's book is going to pick up, because this is some of the early chapters of ACFT development and all of what that went through. But I guess, I mean, I can just give you a chance here if you want to, or I can ramble a little bit on General Hertling's involvement. And many people today may see General Hertling on the news frequently. General now retired Hertling has provided a lot of commentary on Ukraine stuff, but he has a background in exercise science and at the Department of Physical Education and things like that. And his Command and General Staff College thesis was titled Physical Training for the Modern Battlefield. And when IMT in its modern iteration came to be, he was the commander of it, and he was deeply, deeply involved in the push to modernize Army fitness and finally break away from the APFT. And that was like over a decade-long process to get there. I guess I'll throw it to Dr. East to kind of tell me what to take away from that.
So, yeah, General Hertling is another, along with General Milley, General Townsend, there's some others in there I'll think about as we go along. But General Hertling was the driving force in 2010 behind the effort to change the APFT. It was not the first effort, but it was the first major effort coming from that command level. And we made some progress, and we established a plan to develop the new test. And in the middle of that process, General Hertling was selected to become the USAR commander and PCS from Eustis to Europe. It really took the wind out of the sails, and other individuals were not as supportive of where that particular test got to. It was a 5-item test. You can like it or not like it, but the ultimate question became, is this 5-item test demonstratively better than the 3-event test? And it was reviewed by a variety of different individuals, and the ultimate answer was no, it's not. And so it ended in this beginning of 2012, and it was at that point that the process to come up with the ACFT began with Exhorto 4113. So yeah, it would have, if you could go back and have General Hurling there another year or two, who knows? It maybe was a different outcome. But.
So thinking about, I guess we're up to modern day now, somewhat post 9/11. How enmeshed into this conversation around physical fitness testing and physical culture is the discussion around these embedded human performance teams? Because I think back like POTIF on the special operations side of the house and Admiral McRaven, and kind of analyzing, what was happening in the battle space in the early 2000s. And I think his comment at the time was something along the lines of like, there's high schools that get better treatment than our soldiers do. We touched on it a little bit, I think, earlier, talking about how, we have this physical test idea, and then there's follow-on training to improve the physical test, and you would have your strength coach and your dietitian, blah, 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 blah. So is there a commentary to be had around the prevalence of those teams now on both the special operations side and the conventional side, and how that relates to discussions around physical fitness testing and physical culture in general?
So I hate the fact that I believe that ultimately this issue comes down to a funding issue. Mm-hmm. And it is, I think, imperative and inevitable that we train and treat our soldiers the way we train and treat our elite athletes. I think we owe our soldiers that commitment. And we're not nearly there yet. And my hope is that we will continue to eat away at that manning requirement until we get to the point where every regular Army unit has access to those people and programs, and we're able to figure out a solution for Compo 2 and 3 to have access to those individuals, either directly through the Army or indirectly through private providers in their home states or territories. So this issue with recruiting and retention really has brought this back to the forefront again, because we better keep everybody we can keep, and we better keep them healthy, and we better keep them fit. It's just an imperative, and we need to provide that for our soldiers. We had a soldier in our command a few years ago who ostensibly tore her ACL, and it was, I want to say, 4 months before she had an MRI to determine whether her ACL was torn or not. By that time, she was done. We lost her as a soldier because we didn't have the ability to provide the services and care that we should have provided. So it's just really critical.
So I guess off the back of that, and this will serve as my closer, and I know Alex might have one, but given the breadth of the time span of your book, and the fact that we have a much bigger military now, we have much more data-driven solutions for physical testing. We just talked about the embedded human performance stuff. Are we fitter? Is the military fitter now than it was in World War I in the 1800s? going all the way back, is the trajectory going up, down, nowhere in particular? What are your thoughts on that? And let me, before you go, I just want to add to that real quickly, because you look at these pictures of these guys in like World War I, World War II. I mean, like, they're doing some insane stuff. Alex mentioned La Sierra High School, like middle schoolers that were doing things that, arguably people today and soldiers specifically probably couldn't do. So sorry not to interrupt, but back to you.
I'll try to answer in a couple of different ways. Number one, I'm somewhat insulated by the nature of the job that I did, both at the academy and at Eustis. And so the people that were around me day in and day out, all compo, were at kind of the top of the fitness game. They were people who it was part of their life. Alex can talk about the NCOs that we brought in to do the mobile training teams. They were all like just outstanding from a physical standpoint. So that kind of colors my thought. One of the first times I sat down with General Milley, we said, hey, sir, we've got this idea, holistic health and fitness. We need to roll that out, and then we can roll the test out. He said, no, we're going to roll the test out first. He said, the test is going to become the leverage to get people to train. I assume that's true. I don't have any. On my last trips, I'm driving across, Benning and Carson and Drum and Leavenworth, and I see people out doing power moves and deadlifting, and so I believe that is true. There is a subset in there. I think that's problematic, and they perhaps have always been problematic, and we need to find out how to bring those folks aboard. My last comment about that is I did tours at West Point for 13 years for people coming back for their class reunions, and they were all, well, it's just easy now, and and I'm like, dude, you couldn't get in today, both from a fitness and from an academic standpoint. So be glad you went in 1995 or something. So I think generally our young people are as fit or more fit. I think we just have the wherewithal to kind of push our problems to the fore, and we're not looking at just at how really well our young people are doing in training. So,
well, my tongue-in-cheek comment for that, and Alex, I don't remember which episode we were doing this on, but I've always had this statement of like, why have we changed the fitness test if we were winning in World War I and World War II? Like, we haven't dominated the battlefield as much as we did at that time. Why did we change it? But I mean, obviously, technology changes, the battlefield changes, etc. So, no, I think that was perfect.
So I'll try and bring us to a close here. When we booked Dr. East, we told him this conversation would be about an hour, and now that we're at the 2-hour mark, I'm realizing that tracks pretty accurately with expectation versus reality. When I stopped by Dr. East's office for quick chats before he retired, this is on par with how long conversations go. So I appreciate it. And I also will riff briefly. He mentioned the switch of like, logically it would make sense that you would implement something like H2F to show the force how to train, and then you would implement the test. And it seemed crazy to me at first to switch it, to put the test first and then the program. But I do, in retrospect, think the senior leaders that were involved in that decision were probably right. You need the test as a forcing function to reveal the need to train, to get the force to care and things like that.
So Alex, what it's also done is, and you were at the most recent H2F symposium, is you have a ton of senior leaders who are like, gimme, and they all are doing the best they can during this interim, but they all want help. So
yeah, absolutely. So what I'll do to close it, I'm gonna read a series of quotes here, and this is gonna be kind of long, but what I will ask our audience to do is we had to move fairly quickly, and we didn't move that quickly, but we got through this book quick in terms of covering the content that Dr. East covers in it. I would highly encourage anyone who's listening to this who's remotely interested to go just read the book. You can find it for free on Army University Press. There'll be a link in the show notes, or you can get yourself a hard copy, or if you're a big nerd like us.
I bought the hard copy today, even though I had the free PDF.
And if you're not feeling up to reading the whole book, at least read chapter 8, because chapter 8 is where Dr. East really hammers home his thesis. He provides kind of a quick synopsis of everything he talked about before, and then some key takeaways. And what I'm going to do right now, for the audience's sake, and hopefully this doesn't take too much time, is read a few what I would call hot takes from chapter 8. These are some fairly aggressive thesis statements from Dr. East.
There's a special segment of the Mops Most podcast, hot takes from Dr. East.
Yeah, I'm just gonna read them out because I think they are worth the audience hearing, so they can realize what they're going to get from a book like this. It's not your standard Army publication kind of thing. All right, quote number 1. Although there are arguably some team building benefits from quote unquote unit PT, a platoon or company sized extended rectangular formation is not a productive exercise environment. That's number 1. Number 2, in a 2003 survey of 2,000 active duty officers and NCOs, a significant number of respondents stated that unit PT interfered with their personal exercise prescription to the point it diminished their overall physical readiness. Quote number 3. Although convenient for the Army, the 0630 PT schedule is problematic on many levels. Since the duty day generally starts at 09, starting PT at 6:30 conveys to active component soldiers the notion that PT is an ancillary duty, not to be confused with their real job, which happens during the duty day. 6:30 is also likely the worst time of day to conduct physical training. The body is less hydrated, the muscles are cold, stiff, and generally out of fuel. Many of the early Army PRT leaders recommended 1000 or 1 to 2 hours after breakfast as the optimal time to conduct physical training. Even saying that out loud is like grounds
blasphemy.
Yeah.
How dare you, Alex? How dare you?
All right, we got 2 left to go. Quote number 4, every war in which the United States has been involved since 1860 has revealed the physical deficiencies of our soldiers during the initial mobilization. Casualties in initial engagements were attributed to the inability of our soldiers to physically withstand the rigors of combat. I don't actually think that's a Dr. East original. I think he was quoting that from a previous Army manual, but it belongs in here, I think. And then the final one, which is, I find this to kind of be Dr. East's thesis of the book. I don't know if he meant it that way, but due to the absence of a systemic and pervasive PRT doctrine with consolidated and enduring support from Army leaders, the Army's emphasis on physical readiness training has followed a sinusoidal pattern of surge and consolidation through multiple force mobilizations and times of peace. During the periods of rapid force mobilization, military and civilian leaders bemoan the poor health and fitness of the civilian population and the extraordinary task of conditioning conscripts and volunteers for combat. During the periods of forced consolidation, political and economic influencers have caused national leaders to casually abandon the physical lessons learned from the Battle of the Somme to Task Force Smith, from Ia Drang to the Korengal Valley. Throughout its 200-plus year history, the United States Army has consistently failed to provide PRT programs and resources to adequately prepare soldiers for combat. Army leaders have essentially relegated physical readiness to the quote-unquote and other duties as assigned category of training. That's what it is.
Yeah, that took a bit to get past the readers, the editors. So
I once published a Center for Army Lessons Learned article, and they made me remove a single sentence about how first sergeants want to make up for lost time and do the hardest PT sessions right after leave. And like even the insinuation that first sergeants might not have perfectly the right idea of how to conduct physical training, they would not allow me to publish that. I cannot believe you got that paragraph published.
Well, wait till the new edition. It sets off in several other areas too. So.
I'm incredibly excited.
Yeah.
Well, I know Alex mentioned that we had you on for an hour and then we went to 2. So I want to be the first to say thank you for hanging out with us this long. I think this is a fascinating conversation. And like we mentioned, we crammed about 200 plus years of history into 120-ish minutes. So I'll be the first one to tell people to literally go read the book. It is free. You can find it online for free, or buy it, or do both, which is what I did. But thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.